This is week 2, Psychosocial Theories. This is actually a really exciting week because we're going to talk about identity development, and it's so core to the work that we do that with students because so much of this happens while they're in college. So I want to open by talking about the work of Erik Erikson. He offers an 8-stage model. We're actually only going to focus on 2 of those stages today, but he talks about how this 8-stage model of development is really distinguished by a crisis or turning point. So something that happens in a person's life, how they make sense of it, their feelings, what they're thinking, all of that is what really progresses them through these stages. And he talks about the first 4 stages focusing on childhood, then moves into identity into adulthood. So stage 5 is identity versus identity confusion. And in this stage, we see people asking a very popular question, who am I? And trying to figure out who they are and sense of the world around them. They might have this call to define themselves, to figure out who they are. And a lot of people who struggle to really develop this core sense of self, they might experience confusion and insecurities, and you'll hear this referred to as identity diffusion. And so that's where support is really important in a student's life when they are struggling to really develop this sense of self, helping them really be able to understand that and helping work with them to answer these questions alongside of them, because some will get stuck in a sense if they're not able to progress. And so this is stage 5, identity versus identity confusion. In stage 6, intimacy versus isolation, we see people trying to figure out who they are, developing their identity in terms of others around them. So they're entering these committed relationships with friends, intimate relationships, and really becoming a member of a community. And a lot of times a good way to illustrate this, you might see a student who's participating in Greek life. They are rushing a sorority and trying to figure out who they are in the sense of a community of other women who are involved in this. And they might wear their letters or really identify as a member of that group. And so one thing to keep in mind, if young adults struggle with this sense of identity, they may struggle building relationships, which can lead to emotional stress and isolation. So I think that's one of the concerns for this, is that if they really can't progress from stage 5, where they're developing their identity, they're going to struggle in stage 6. So I'm going to transition and talk for a few minutes about the 7 vectors. And this is a really popular theory within student affairs, within student development. I think it's extremely easily applied to the work that we do with students. So much of it really defines why they act the way they do or respond to certain situations within the college setting. And Arthur Chickering is the founder of this theory, but in 1993 he and Linda Reiser redeveloped it, reconstructed it, and it's really what is most popular, what's most known as the Chickering and Reiser version of these 7 vectors, which is in 1993. So these 7 vectors basically talk about this progression that a student moves through. Arthur Chickering used the word vector because he wanted people to know that the progression is not always linear, that some students kind of move through it at different rates. Some take a while, some move through them a little bit faster, just depending on their external circumstances. And they really build upon each other. They're like stair steps. And so we'll move on and I'll show you an actual illustration, kind of a visual for the 7 vectors. So here we see this nonlinear version of what students might progress through. And this will make more sense once we actually talk through the different vectors. But you see that this is a typical model. This isn't necessarily how every student will experience it. But, in that first year, really developing competence, developing autonomy, managing emotions into the first and sophomore year. And then you see this second sort of portion of developing identity and these interpersonal relationships and purpose and integrity, all these being sort of toward the second end of their college experience and beyond. So developing competence. Well, there's three kind of competence that Chickering and Reiser refer to, and that is physical and manual skills, intellectual competence, and interpersonal competence. With interpersonal competence, you see the value of learning to live in a community, to even beyond that, to really be able to confront those that you're living with. So they're kind of grappling with this idea of what it means to get to know people and live with people in community. They're also kind of developing their analytical skills and being able to learn a new system of education, if you think about it. I mean, the way that they might have performed in high school is very different than how they're learning the college setting operates. And so that's why I think a first year seminar course, it's called different at different places, but the first year experience course is so effective because a lot of times they'll focus on helping students develop academic success skills and social skills and learning to really function in a community. And that's one of the reasons that you see so much higher rates of retention and academic success when students are involved in these courses, because they really are targeted at helping students kind of move through these areas of competence. Managing emotions. So students coming to college for the first time, or maybe they're returning, they inevitably face anxiety, anger, fear, hurt, tension, happiness. They experience so many different emotions. And that's just simply, part of the experience of moving away from home and, being homesick and finding life on your own and developing relationships that with people that are very different than you. And so I think the question is how students work through these emotions. Not that they necessarily eliminate emotions and act as if nothing has happened, but when they have a moment of anger, when their roommate takes something from their closet and wears it and rips a shirt, and how do they really handle the situation? Or it could be something that's completely not even happening on the college campus. If it's something from back home and they have this tension and they're trying to figure out how to balance what's happening at school with what's happening at home. It's just really how they manage their emotions while they're in college. And so one of the things as student affairs professionals for us to really kind of key into is this idea of signals. And we really need to know how students are managing, how they're allowing their emotions to become signals, because everyone gets upset, but do they really cut it off at a certain point, or do they just begin to feed it even further? And they just really have no sense of self-regulation. And so we kind of have to be in tune to students and their responses to various situations to be able to help them. And so I think one of the things that Evans et al. Talks about is self-regulation, not repression, and not just burying emotions or burying what they're feeling, but being able to control it and regulate it for themselves. Moving through autonomy toward interdependence. So I don't know if you guys have ever been to a mall that's really crowded and you're waiting on a spot, and as you're sitting there, you're thinking, good gracious, it can't possibly take that long. Turn on the car and back it up. I mean, it just feels like they're taking forever. You're actually correct. Studies have shown that people who know that there's somebody else who's waiting on their spot will take even longer. And I think built inside of each of us is this desire to be in control, to kind of have this sense of control. And for students, we see that a lot as they're kind of growing in their time in college that they are beginning to pursue their self-chosen goals. For so long, they've had such a tremendous influence, maybe from their parents or from their peers, and now they're beginning to have more of a sense of autonomy. Well, we also see a shift in moving from understanding themselves in this sense to interdependence. So they respect the autonomy of others. It's like a give and a take relationship with their friends. Developing mature interpersonal relationships. And so in this vector, we see that students are beginning to appreciate differences, that they have a curiosity and openness toward other cultures, other people and ideas. And I had a student who was in my freshman seminar class, and I saw her this year. She was in my class 2 years ago. She had studied abroad in Vienna, and we grabbed coffee. We were just catching up, and she was telling me about how she had lived with people from Australia and Vienna and from Canada and all these places all over. And I remember being just so surprised because she was the student that during her freshman year had sat in the corner with this other girl from her hometown, and they really hadn't talked to anybody else. It was just, she kept to herself. And then to hear her talking about having all these friends from different places and that she was planning to go for spring break to visit all of them, it just really surprised me. But then I think about this vector, that part of developing mature interpersonal relationships is really being able to appreciate differences. And she just hadn't really been at that place when she came her freshman year. And so that was really exciting for me to see that she was coming into this vector, that she was moving through this time and really developing these really quality relationships with people who are different than herself. Establishing identity. So this vector really depends on the other vectors that I've mentioned. It's a host of variables coming together, whether that's being comfortable with your body, your appearance, your gender and sexual orientation, your level of self-acceptance and self-esteem, all these pieces coming together and integrating. It's really, as the first part of this vector, we see a lot of times people are experimenting with some of these pieces, whether you might have an introvert who you really haven't heard her say much of anything, and then she stands up at a poetry slam and just shares her heart. Or another student who he's dressed a certain way all year that you've known him, and then he begins to completely try a new style, and he's just really figuring out who he is and what he's about. And so, but I think beyond those pieces, there's also this idea that they are reflecting on their family of origin, that their ethnic heritage, that they're seeing themselves in this social and historical context. And so it's a lot deeper than just, trying a new style or, being a little bit different. I had a student who we did a diversity activity, and afterward she came up to me and she said, I never really thought about being Jewish making me so different, that was something that made me so different. And she said, I guess back home there's so many people who are Jewish, and so I never realized coming to the South and just being like the only person that I've really known in my classes and on my hall that's Jewish. I just never really felt different until here right now. And just how, it's not just my culture, but it's, religion and so much more than that. And so she was coming into understanding this, heritage, this concept, this social and historical context, but even her own faith commitment, like that, all these pieces coming together. She had never really sort of searched that out because she had never been really in a situation where she felt like she needed to. And so that was such an interesting thing to me to see her coming into this idea of who am I, and who am I here, but what's my family about, and what am I like. Developing a purpose. And so much of this vector is about really identifying or clarifying your goals, being able to persist despite obstacles, that you're figuring out your vocational plans and aspirations, your personal interests. And for Christians, it's really coming into the sense of, what has God called me to be? What does He want me to do to serve Him? And I actually love this quote by Parker Palmer from Let Your Life Speak. He says, "Calling comes from a voice external to ourselves, a voice of moral demand that asks us to become someone we are not yet, someone different, someone better, someone just beyond our reach." And so I think back to what we talked about last session with challenge and support. We really want students to kind of think through this idea of being someone better, someone just beyond our reach. And so part of this vector in developing a purpose is really, exercising intentionality and really coming into an understanding of what we were created for. Developing integrity. So in this final vector, in the seventh vector, we see that this is where students are developing a congruence between their personal values and socially responsible behavior, that they have uncompromising beliefs, principled thinking. Sometimes this will happen in their junior or senior year. Sometimes it takes being in the work world and being presented with sort of an ethical situation where they have to, an ethical dilemma that they have to really exercise what they really believe and think through these kinds of things. But ultimately want to move them toward this vector and really challenge them in their thinking so that they will be able to have congruence between their values and their behaviors. So I want to close our time out here by talking very briefly about transition theory. Nancy Schlossberg has done some excellent work talking about transition theory. She says that a transition is any event or non-event that results in changed relationships, routines, assumptions, and roles. So a non-event is something that did not happen. That kind of sounds confusing, except that, let's say that a student applies for a leadership position. Let's say they apply to be an RA. If they don't get that position, the event actually doesn't happen. So they don't become an RA. They don't enter into that role. But the fact that they didn't get it actually has an effect on them. So a non-event is something that didn't happen, but it still has an effect on the student. Whether that affects who they live with or how they feel about themselves or whatever it is. So the transition exists only if it is defined by the individual experiencing it. So if they attach significance to it, that's why it would be called a transition. The context refers to the person's relationship to the transition as well as the setting, and the impact is the degree to which the transition alters the person's life. So the best way to summarize transition theory is through the 4 S's, which we'll talk about. In order to evaluate the impact of the transition, you have to consider 4 variables. The 4 S's, as they're called: situation, self, support, and strategies. When you're thinking about the situation, you might ask the question, what was the trigger? What caused the transition? Was it on time? Was it expected? Were there multiple sources of stress present? When you're thinking about self, you look at the personal and demographic characteristics. When you're thinking about support, you look at the social support, the family units, the networks. And then finally, when you're talking about strategies, you have to consider what their coping strategies are. Do they have control? Do they understand the meaning of the problem? And so you really have to evaluate these 4 components when you're trying to determine how a student reacts or the impact of a transition on the student and their development. This concludes the second session of psychosocial theory.